On the 13th of January 1956, Dr. Morris Jessup, a distinguished scientist and author of The Case for the UFO, received a strange letter at his Miami home. Written on hotel notepaper and postmarked Gainesville, Texas, the letter was a long, rambling scrawl written in different colored pens and pencils. Its language was arcane and, in places, barely literate. But its contents were sensational. The writer claimed that in the autumn of 1943, the US destroyer Eldridge, while in dock in Philadelphia, was at the flick of a switch rendered invisible. Moments later, the ship is supposed to have appeared 300 miles away in Norfolk, Virginia. Then, just as mysteriously, vanished again, materializing within minutes back in Philadelphia. Was what became known as the Philadelphia experiment merely the product of someone's overactive imagination, or did it really happen? The bizarre letter was the second Jessup had received from the same writer. The first, 3 months earlier, did not mention the Eldridge, but discussed at length the levitation of massive objects and the use of anti-gravity to transport them through time and space. Both letters were signed Carlos Miguel Allende. Jessup had initially dismissed them as the work of a crank, but he was intrigued. His book on UFOs had been published the year before in 1955 and was considered an intelligent and reasonably credible view on how an as-yet undiscovered principle of anti-gravity might be used to cause things to vanish and reappear elsewhere. Jessup began to wonder if there was more to the strange letters than met the eye. He knew that during the Second World War, the US military had conducted all kinds of top-secret experiments. Perhaps Allende had witnessed some strange occurrence. Jessup decided to send Allende a postcard, asking if he had any evidence with which to substantiate his incredible allegations. Busy on a new book, Jessup thought no more about it. Nearly 5 months later, in May 1956, he received a third letter from Allende. It was just as cryptic and just as strangely written as the others. Although unable to produce any tangible proof, Allende repeated his claims that the Eldridge had vanished from Philadelphia and reappeared a short time later after a brief sighting in Norfolk. Allende, who said he'd witnessed the whole thing from a nearby ship, claimed that the experiment had had a devastating effect on the Eldridge crew, with half of them suffering mental breakdowns. Jessup couldn't tell if Allende's story was an elaborate hoax or not. He decided to forget the whole thing. And there the matter might have rested, had it not been for the intervention of the US Office of Naval Research, or ONR, in Washington, D.C. In the summer of 1955, some time before the strange letters to Jessup, an anonymous package marked Happy Easter arrived at the ONR. The package contained a copy of Jessup's book. Many of the passages were marked and the margins filled with notes on teleportation, magnetic fields, telepathy, and cosmic rays. At the time, the US military placed a high priority on anti-gravity research. As he tried to make sense of the annotations, Major Darrell Ritter, the ONR case officer, wondered if its anonymous sender had inadvertently stumbled across some top-secret project. He decided to hand the book over to Commander George Hoover, a prominent member of the ONR Project Orbiter Committee, which was closely involved in anti-gravity research. In the spring of 1957, Jessup was invited to Washington. As soon as he saw the book, he knew immediately that the notes in it had been made by the same person who'd sent him the strange letters. The Navy's interest in the matter convinced Jessup that Allende's allegations concerning the Eldridge were perhaps not so far-fetched after all. When copies of the book were printed and circulated in senior government and military circles, Jessup worried that perhaps he already knew too much about something which had been covered up for the last 14 years. Towards the end of October 1958, Jessup went to New York to see his friend Ivan Sanderson, a prominent naturalist. Over dinner, he told his host and 2 other guests he wished to speak with them privately. Jessup produced one of his annotated books and asked them to read it and lock it away. He was highly agitated, saying that he was certain something terrible was about to happen to him. Jessup then returned home to Florida. Within a few days, he was involved in a serious car accident. It took him weeks to recover. After that, his state of mind deteriorated rapidly. In April 1959, he wrote to one of his oldest friends, Long John Nebel, a New York TV talk show host, saying he intended to kill himself. On the 20th of April, Jessup was due to have dinner with another friend, Dr. Manson Valentine. He said that after a great deal of research, he'd reached some startling and terrifying conclusions about the Philadelphia experiment, which he wanted to share with him. But he never made it to the dinner. At 6:30 p.m., he was discovered in his car, barely breathing. A hose was attached to the exhaust pipe. Despite frantic efforts to revive him, Jessup died within a few minutes. It looked like suicide. But later, rumors began to circulate that though he was known to have been depressed, he had in fact been murdered to prevent him from revealing what he knew about the Philadelphia experiment. By the summer of 1943, the Second World War was at its height. On the 10th of July, the Allies stormed the beaches of Sicily. The long fight to take Europe back from the Nazis had begun. 2 weeks later, according to Allende, the Philadelphia experiment took place. Could the US government really have found a way to make a warship disappear? The US Navy was already working with Albert Einstein. Is it possible they were testing his unified field theory? Einstein first came up with this extraordinary concept in the 1920s. He believed that if the 3 basic universal forces of electromagnetism, gravity, and nuclear energy were combined, they would create a single force field. By surrounding an object with this field, the object, in theory, would then enter a time-space warp and disappear. Enormous resources were then placed at Einstein's disposal to see if the theory could be put into practice. Although Hitler's days were numbered, the Allies knew his brilliant scientists had been developing a series of devastating new weapons, including ground-to-air guided missiles and the atomic bomb. The Allies were now in a desperate high-tech race. High on everyone's agenda was the theory of invisibility. Any military commander in the field who had the ability to conceal his troops and weaponry at will could deal the enemy a knockout blow. Camouflage and invisibility had been key factors to the success and safety of fighting men on all sides throughout the history of warfare. During the First World War, military artists painted warships and merchant ships in a disruptive pattern, making them harder to identify. This technique was known as dazzle. Bold patterns, shapes, and colors were applied to ships in such a way that when viewed through the periscope of a submarine or from an enemy ship, they couldn't be seen clearly against the horizon. It was almost impossible for the enemy to gauge the correct range at which to fire its guns or torpedoes. As technology became more advanced, particularly at sea, so too did the art of camouflage. When the Second World War broke out in September 1939, planes became more prevalent as weapons of war, but dazzle could not protect ships from the air. It was obvious something much more sophisticated was required. With the entry of the United States into the war in December 1941, some of the best scientific brains in the world were harnessed to discover whether invisibility was a viable proposition, especially for ships. If such a thing were possible, then the war at sea could be won. Many of the scientists working for the Allies were German Jews, driven from their homeland in the 1930s by Hitler's Aryan policies. Albert Einstein was one of them. Born in 1879, Einstein was a mathematical physicist years ahead of his time. He'd arrived in the US in 1932, and a year later become a professor at Princeton University. In August 1939, when the start of the Second World War in Europe was less than a month away, Einstein wrote to President Roosevelt, warning him of Germany's plans to harness nuclear energy for military purposes. In 1942, as a direct result of Einstein's letter, the US government authorized its own nuclear weapons program, called the Manhattan Project. It was the most secret scientific operation of the entire war. Meanwhile, the US Defense Department employed Einstein's genius in helping to create a less destructive, but nonetheless effective means of winning the war. Whether or not this led to the Philadelphia experiment is not known. Although no official records of the experiment apparently exist, and the Office of Naval Research has always denied that such an experiment ever took place, this, according to Allende, is what is supposed to have occurred. In the summer of 1943, the USS Eldridge was fitted with tons of electronic equipment, including 2 huge generators mounted in place of the forward gun turret. At 9 a.m. on the 22nd of July, the generators were switched on. Within a few minutes, the ship was surrounded by a hazy green fog. Then it completely vanished. 15 minutes later, the generators were turned off and the ship slowly materialized again through the green fog. The crew was found dazed and feeling sick. 3 months later, on the 28th of October, the Navy was ready for another try, this time out in the open sea. The generators were turned on, and as before, a green fog slowly enveloped the ship as she disappeared. Within seconds, she materialized briefly in Norfolk, Virginia, 300 miles away, before reappearing at the Philadelphia Naval Yard a few moments later. But this time, the effect on the crew was much more traumatic. Some were so disturbed that they were committed to psychiatric hospitals for the rest of their lives. According to Allende, their families were told they'd been killed in action. The US Navy decided not to repeat the experiment. The US authorities have always dismissed his account as pure fiction. But there are still those who believe that the US Navy has its own reasons for still wanting to keep the real truth behind the Philadelphia experiment, a closely guarded secret. The USS Eldridge was built in Newark, New Jersey, and launched in the summer of 1943. According to US Navy records, the ship then remained in New York and Long Island Sound until the 16th of September, when she sailed to Bermuda to undergo sea trials. In mid-October, the Eldridge returned to New York in a convoy. 2 weeks later, she was called to the US Navy base in Norfolk. From there, she sailed for Casablanca, arriving on the 22nd of November. By mid-December, the Eldridge was back in New York, where she remained for 2 weeks, taking part in a training exercise before heading to Norfolk once again. In the first week of January 1944, she was sent out into the North Atlantic as one of the escort ships to a large merchant convoy. Then on to the Mediterranean, where she supported the Allied operations in North Africa. At no time, insisted the US Navy, was the Eldridge anywhere near Philadelphia. If the Navy records are true, then what prompted Allende to write to Jessup claiming to have witnessed the apparent disappearance and teleportation of the Eldridge between Philadelphia and Norfolk? There's no doubt that Allende served as a deckhand aboard the Liberty ship, the Furuseth. But were his ship and the Eldridge ever in the same area at the same time? According to Navy records, the Eldridge left Newark for Brooklyn on the 17th of August 1943 and arrived there the next day. The Furuseth sailed from Norfolk on the 16th of August, travelling up the coast in a convoy before heading east towards North Africa. It's quite possible she passed the Eldridge en route to Brooklyn as the destroyer emerged from Delaware Bay on the morning of the 17th. Did Allende really see something strange as the two ships drew near, and over the next few years become confused in his own mind over dates and locations? He was adamant he had watched the Eldridge materialize in Norfolk and then vanish again, turning up in Philadelphia a few moments later. But he told no one at the time, and certainly from that day to this, no one has ever corroborated his incredible story. Later, Lieutenant William Dodge, master of the Furuseth, categorically denied that either he or any of his crew had seen anything unusual while in Norfolk. And William Van Allen, captain of the Eldridge, said that his ship had never been to Philadelphia. It was suggested that if Allende had seen what he thought was something strange happening to a ship in the Norfolk Naval Yard, it may have been nothing more sinister than a degaussing installation. An ingenious British innovation adopted by the US Navy during the war to protect ships from magnetic mines. It involved fitting a series of electric cables around the outside of the ship's hull from bow to stern. By running a measured current through the cables, it was possible to cancel out the ship's magnetic field. The equipment could be turned on while the ship was at sea in a combat area. If it worked properly, the ship would then be magnetically invisible to mines, although still clearly visible to the naked eye and detectable by radar or underwater listening devices. The US Navy later suggested that a misunderstanding of how degaussing functioned might well have given rise to the supposition that they were experimenting with total invisibility. But the story of the Philadelphia experiment refused to die down. The Navy's information officers became so exasperated at having to deal with constant inquiries that they resorted to putting out a standard statement claiming that the Navy had never conducted any experiments on invisibility either in 1943 or at any other time. The Navy also produced the Eldridge's log and war diary from the relevant period. This clearly shows that the destroyer was nowhere near either Philadelphia or Norfolk during the period in question. Throughout the 1960s, journalists and other investigators made repeated attempts to track down the mysterious Carl Miguel Allende. But no one could find him. Had he even existed in the first place? It began to look as if whoever had contacted the late Dr. Jessup in 1956 with his rambling account of a disappearing warship had pulled off an astonishing hoax. But in 1969, Allende, whose real name was Carl M. Allen, appeared at the offices of the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization. He claimed that after reading Jessup's book, he'd been so frightened he'd invented the story of the Philadelphia experiment. Later, however, Allende denied making such a confession. He insisted once more that he really had seen the Eldridge disappear when he was an 18-year-old deckhand on the Furuseth, but by now, no one believed him. Allende had left the Merchant Navy in 1952, taking various casual oil drilling jobs. When he was eventually tracked down by journalists and authors, he was adamant about what he had seen, although vague and evasive about the details. He died in a Colorado nursing home in 1994. To this day, no one really knows whether his extraordinary claims were true or if he was just an attention seeker with an overactive imagination. As for the Eldridge, the destroyer which may or may not have been made to disappear, she finished her war service in the Pacific. In January 1951, she was sold to the Greek government, renamed the Leon, and scrapped a few years later. But the legend persisted. In 1984, the so-called Philadelphia experiment was even the subject of a full-length feature film, with a sequel in 1991. In March 1999, 15 surviving members of the Eldridge's wartime crew met for a reunion in Atlantic City, New Jersey. All were highly amused about the continuing rumors that they'd been involved in a top-secret experiment. All denied any such thing, wondering why, out of all the US Navy ships, theirs had been the one singled out as the subject of such a wild story, especially since, as they all firmly pointed out, the Eldridge had never docked in Philadelphia at any time during the war. There's no doubt that the Second World War was a period of accelerated research, during which many previously unthinkable concepts, such as rocket travel, jet propulsion, and the military use of nuclear energy, became reality. But whether or not such research included making a ship vanish into thin air remains one of the 20th century's most compelling mysteries.